Shalom, shalom, everybody, and good morning. It's your sister here again with another book reading or continued book reading on the creation of Patriarchy by Gerda Lerner. Again, you can find the link in the description box if you're here on YouTube. If you're on Facebook, you can go to the Hebrew Culture Connection or just check my page to see the link for the book if you want to purchase it. So the chapter we're starting on today is chapter 7, and the name of this chapter is The Goddess. So we have seen how in Mesopotamian societies the institutionalization of patriarchy created sharply defined boundaries between women of different classes. Although the development of the new gender definitions and of the customs associated with them proceeded unevenly, the state, during the process of the establishment of written law codes, increased the property rights of upper class women, while it circumscribed their sexual rights and finally totally eroded them. The lifelong dependency of women on and husbands became so firmly established in law and custom as to be considered natural and God given. In the case of lower class women, their labor power served either their families or those who owned their families. Their sexual and reproductive capacities were commodified, traded, leased, or sold in the interest of male family members. Women of all classes had traditionally been excluded from military power and were, by the turn of the first millennium BC, excluded from formal education, insofar as it had become institutionalized. Yet, even then, powerful women in powerful roles lived on in cultural service, in religious representation, and in symbols. There was a considerable time lag between the subordination of women in patriarchal society and the declassing of the goddess. As we trace below changes in the as we trace below changes in the position of male and female god figures in the pantheon of gods in a period of over 1,000 years, we should keep in mind that the power of the goddesses and priestesses daily life and in popular religion continued in force even as the supreme goddesses were dethroned. It is remarkable that in societies which had subordinated women economically, educationally, and legally, the spiritual and metaphysical power of goddesses remained active and strong. We have some indication of what practical religion was like from archaeological artifacts and from temple hymns and prayers. In Mesopotamian societies, the feeding of and service to the gods was considered essential to the survival of the community. This service was performed by male and female temple servants. For important decisions of state, in warfare, and for important personal decisions, one could consult an oracle or a diviner who might be either a man or a woman. In personal distress, sickness, or misfortune, the afflicted person would seek the help of his or her household and, as of no avail, would appeal to any one of a number of gods or goddesses who had particular qualities needed to cure the affliction. If the appeal was to a goddess, the sick person also required the intercession and good services of a priestess of the particular goddess. There were, of course, also male gods who could benefit one in case of illness, and these would usually be served by a male priest. For example, in Babylonia, a sick man or woman would approach the Ishtar temple in a spirit of humility on the assumption that the sickness was a result of his or her transgression. The petitioner would bring appropriate offerings, food, a young animal for sacrifice, oil, and wine. For the goddess Ishtar, such offerings quite frequently included images of vulva or vagina, the symbol of her fertility, fashioned out of precious lapis lazuli stone. The afflicted person would prostrate himself before the priestess and recite some appropriate hymns and prayers. The simple prayer contained the following lines: Gracious Ishtar, who rules over the universe, heroic Ishtar, who creates humankind, who walks before the cattle, who loves the shepherd, you give just to the distressed, the suffering, you give them justice. Without you, the river will not open, the river which brings us life will not be closed. Without you, the canal will not open, the canal from which the scattered drink will not be closed. Ishtar, merciful lady, hear me and grant me mercy. Mesopotamian men or women in distress or sickness humbled themselves before a goddess figure and her priestly servant. In words reflecting the attitude of slave toward master, they praised and worshiped the goddess's power. Thus, under hymn to Ishtar addresses her as mistress of the battlefield, who pulls down the mountains. Majestic one, lioness among the gods, who conquers the angry gods, strongest among rulers, who leads kings by the lead, you who open the wombs of women, mighty Ishtar, how great is your strength. Heaping praise upon praise, the petitioner continued. Where you cast your glance, the dead awaken, the sick arise, the bewildered, beholding your face, find the right way. I appeal to you, miserable and distraught, tortured by pain, your servant. Be merciful and hear my prayer. I await you, my mistress. My soul turns toward you. I beseech you, relieve my plight. Absolve me of my guilt, my wickedness, my sin. Forget my misdeeds. Accept my plea. We should note that the petitioners regarded the goddess as all powerful. In the symbol of the goddess's vulva, fashioned of precious stone and offered up in her praise, they celebrated the sacredness of female sexuality and its mysterious, life giving force, which included the power to heal. And in the very prayers appealing to the goddess's mercy, they praised her as mistress of the battlefield. More powerful than kings, more powerful than other gods. Their prayers to the gods similarly extolled the god's virtues and listed his powers in superlatives. My point here is that men and women offering such prayers when in distress must have thought of women just as they thought of men, as capable of metaphysical power and as potential mediators between the gods and human beings. That is a mental image quite different from that of Christians, for example, who in a later time would pray to the Virgin Mary to intercede with God in their behalf. The power of the Virgin lies in her ability to appeal to God's mercy. It derives from her motherhood and the miracle of her immaculate conception. She has no power for herself, and the very sources of her power to intercede separate her irrevocably from other women. The goddess Ishtar and other goddesses like her had power in their own right. It was the kind of power men had, derived from military exploits and the ability to impose her will on the gods or to influence them. And yet Ishtar was female, endowed with a sexuality like that of ordinary women. One cannot help but wonder at the contradiction between the power of the goddesses and the increasing societal constraints upon the lives of most women in ancient Mesopotamia. Unlike the changes in social economic status of women, which have received only tangential and attention in ancient Mesopotamian studies, the transition from polytheism to monotheism and its attendant shift in emphasis from powerful goddesses to a single male god have been the subject of a vast literature. The topic has been approached from the vantage point of theology, archaeology, anthropology, and literature. Historical and artistic artifacts have been interpreted with the tools of their respective disciplines. Linguistic and philosophical studies have added to the richness of interpretation. With Freud and Jung and Erich Fromm, psychiatry and psychology have been added as analytical tools, focusing our attention on myths, symbols, and archetypes. And recently, a number of feminist scholars from various disciplines have discussed the period and the subject from yet another vantage point, one which is critical of patriarchal assumptions. Such a richness and diversity of sources and interpretations makes it impossible to discuss and critique them all without the confines of this volume. I will therefore focus, and as I have done throughout, on a few analytic questions and discuss in detail a few models which I believe illustrate larger patterns. Methodolo- Methodologically, the most problematic question is the relation between changes in society and changes in religious beliefs and myths. The archaeologist, art historian, and historian can record, document, and observe such changes, but their causes and their meaning cannot be given with any kind of certainty. Different systems of interpretation offer varying answers, none of which is totally satisfying. In the present case, it seems to me most important to record and survey the historical evidence and to offer a coherent explanation, which I admit is somewhat speculative. So are all the other explanations, including, above all, the patriarchal tradition. I am assuming that Mesopotamian religion responded to and reflected social conditions in the various societies. Mental constructs cannot be created from void. They all reflect the events and concepts of historic human beings in society. Thus, the existence of an assembly of the gods in the Epic of Gilgamesh has been interpreted as indicating the existence of village assemblies in pre-state Mesopotamian society. Similarly, the explanation in the Sumerian Atrahasis myth that the gods created men in order that men might serve them and relieve them of hard work can be regarded as a reflection of social conditions in the Sumerian city-states of the first half of the third millennium BC, in which large numbers of people worked on irrigation projects and in agricultural labor centered on the temples. The relation between myth and reality is not usually that direct, but we can assume that no people could invent the concept of an assembly of the gods if they had not at some time experienced and known a like institution on earth. While we cannot say with certainty that certain political and economic changes cause changes in religious beliefs and myths, we cannot help but notice a pattern in the changes of religious beliefs in a number of societies, following upon or concurrent with certain societal changes. My thesis is that just as the development of cloud culture coinciding with increasing militarism brought major changes in kinship and in gender relations, so did the development of strong kingships and of archaic states bring changes in religious beliefs and symbols. The observable pattern is, first, the demotion of the mother goddess figure and the ascendance and later dominance of her male consort or her son. Then his merging with a storm god into a male creator god who heads the pantheon of gods and goddesses. Wherever such changes occur, the power of creation and fertility is transferred from the goddess to the god. The anthropologist Peggy Reeves Sandy offers some very interesting methodological suggestions for interpreting such changes. Sunday argues that gender symbolism in creation stories proves a reliable guide to sex roles and sexual identities in a given society. By articulating how things were in the beginning, people make a basic statement about their relationship with nature and about their perception of the source of power in the universe. Sandy analyzed 112 creation stories and the societies in which they occurred and found clearly defined patterns. She also found a clear correlation between gender definitions in creation stories and a people's mode of acquiring food and their child rearing patterns. Where males pursue animals, fathers are more distant from child rearing, and power is conceived as being beyond man's dominance. When gathering is emphasized, fathers are closer to child rearing, and notions about creative powers turn to feminine or couple symbolism. In the 112 cases studied, 50% had creation stories featuring a male deity, 32% a divine couple, and 18% a female deity. In societies with masculine creation stories, 17% of the fathers cared for their infants, and 52% of the fathers hunted large game. In societies with couple creation stories, 34% of the fathers cared for infants, and 49% of them hunted. Societies with feminine creation stories, 63% of the fathers cared for infants, and 28% hunted large game. If we applied Sanday's generalizations, which are derived from the study of contemporary primitive people backward in time, we should expect to find major economic and social changes to occur prior to or at about the time in which we find evidence of the change in creation stories in the societies of the ancient Near East. Such changes do indeed occur in a number of societies during the second millennium BC. I will attempt to review these developments and then analyze their significance by focusing on the leading explanatory metaphors and symbols. These cluster around three basic questions all religions have to answer. Who creates life? 1. 2. Who brings evil into the world? 3. Who mediates between humans and the supernatural? Or to whom do the gods speak? If these questions are approached by discussing changes in the leading metaphors, what we are looking at are the following changes in symbols. 1. From the vulva of the goddess to the seed of man. 2. From the tree of life to the tree of knowledge. 3. From the celebration of the sacred marriage to the biblical covenant. The pervasiveness of the veneration of the mother goddess in the Neolithic and Chalcolithic periods has been confirmed by archaeological data. Marija Gimbutas reports that approximately 30,000 miniature sculptures in clay, marble, bone, copper, and gold are presently known from a total of some 3,000 sites in southeastern Europe alone, and that these testify to the communal worship of the mother goddess. Gimbutas shows, by means of archaeological evidence, that the Neolithic cultural symbols survived into the 3rd millennium BC in the Aegean area and into the 2nd millennium BC in Crete. E.O. James speaks of a fertility cult which became firmly established in the religion of the ancient Near East with the rise of agriculture in the Neolithic civilization in and after the 5th millennium BC. There is a profusion of archaeological finds of female figurines, all emphasizing breast, navel, and vulva, usually in a squatting position, which is the position commonly adopted in childbirth in this region. We find such a figure in the lowest layers of the excavations of Catalhoyuk at the level of the 7th millennium BC in the form of the birthing goddess. Her legs are parted, her navel and belly protrude, and she is surrounded by bull's horns or stylized bull's head, which may symbolize male procreativity. Similar figurines have been found in sites in the Don Valley of Russia, in Iraq, Anatolia, in Nineveh, Jericho, and in southern Mesopotamia. James, Gimbutas, and others have asserted unequivocally that these figurines are evidence of a widespread fertility cult. Such an assertion has met strong objections on methodological grounds. Can we know, in the absence of corroborating evidence, the figurines and for their contemporaries? How can we read their context, and how can we be certain we interpret their symbolism correctly? Such figurines are, for example, found in great numbers in sites in ancient Israel of the 8th and 7th centuries BC. This was a time when Yahwism was already firmly established as the main religion of Israel. Obviously, the finding of such figurines is not sufficient reason to argue for the existence of widespread mother goddess worship. A similar instance illustrating the limits of generalizations based merely on archaeological evidence is that of statues of the Virgin Mary in the Middle Ages. If an archaeologist of the future were to find thousands of such statues in the villages of Europe, she might be seriously misled if she concluded from such a finding that a female deity was being worshipped there. On the other hand, the archaeologist would undoubtedly also have found evidence of the figure of Christ on the cross, which might affect her conclusions. Thus, the very absence of other figurative representations in comparable numbers in Neolithic sites entitles one to the conclusion that these figures had special, possibly religious meaning. Their common characteristics, their wide dispersal, and conventionalized execution suggest, at the very least, their use as amulets, possibly to help women in childbirth. Such figurines appear for thousands of years in a wide area. Another possible interpretation is that the finding of such figures in many sites speaks to the continued existence of a popular religious practice, which coexists or stands in contrast to established religion. Such a conclusion would be warranted concerning the naked goddess figurines in Israel in the 8th century BC and the images of the Virgin Mary in medieval Europe. The strongest argument in favor of the religious significance of the Neolithic female figures is the historical evidence from the 4th millennium forward, from myths, rituals, and creation stories. The mother goddess is virtually universal as the dominant figure in the most ancient stories. This entitles us to read meaning back into the archaeological findings with some degree of confidence. Still, there is some danger that we may distort the meaning by overgeneralizing from partial evidence. The Assyriologist A.L. Oppenheim cautions against this danger in regard to our interpretation of Mesopotamian religion in the 2nd millennium BC. For this period, much more evidence, archaeological, literary, economic, and political, is available. Yet Oppenheim considers it nearly impossible for modern scholars to reconstruct the worldview and religious values of that civilization. At best, we can say that a profusion of female figurines with sexual features emphasizing maternity found in the Neolithic correspond to later mythological and literary material celebrating the power of female goddess over fertility and fecundity. It is likely that this featured earlier goddess worship, but it is not certain. We are on firmer ground with archaeological evidence from the 4th millennium forward. Female goddess figures appear in more elaborate settings and with distinct and consistently recurring symbolic attributes. The goddess is shown amidst pillars or trees, accompanied by goats, snakes, birds. Eggs and symbols of vegetation are associated with her. These symbols indicate that she was worshipped as a source of fertility for vegetation, animals, and humans. She is represented by the Minoan snake goddess with her breast exposed. She was venerated in Sumer as Ninhursag and Inanna, in Babylon as Kubab and Ishtar, in Phoenicia as Astarte, in Canaan as Anat, in Greece as Hecate Artemis. Her frequent association with the moon symbolized her mystical powers over nature and the seasons. The belief system manifested in great goddess worship was monistic and animistic. There was unity among earth and the stars, humans and nature, birth and death, all of which were embodied in the great goddess. The cults of the great goddess were based on the belief that it is she in one or another of her manifestations who creates life, but she was also associated with death. She was praised and celebrated for her virginity and her maternal qualities. The goddess Ishtar, for example, was described as free with her sexual favors, the protector of prostitutes, the patron of alehouses, and simultaneously the virginal bride of gods, as in the Demotion myths. Female sexuality was sacred to her service and honored in her rituals. Ancient people saw no contradictions in these contrasting attributes. The duality of the goddess represented the duality observable in nature, night and day, birth and death, light and darkness. Thus, in the earliest known phases of religious worship, the female force was recognized as awesome, powerful, and transcendent. The supremacy of the goddess is also expressed in the earliest myths of which celebrate the life-giving creativity of the female. In Egyptian mythology, the primeval ocean, the goddess Nun, gives birth to the sun god Atum, who then creates the rest of the universe. The Sumerian goddess Namu creates parthenogenetically the male sky god An and the female earth goddess Ki or Kai. In Babylonian myth, the goddess Tiamat, the primeval sea consort, gives birth to gods and goddesses. In Greek mythology, the earth goddess in a virgin birth creates the sky, Uranus. The creation of humans is also ascribed to her. In the older wise Mami, also known as Nintu, the mother womb, the one who creates mankind, fashions humans out of clay, but it is the male god Ea who opened the navel of the figures, thus completing the life-giving process. In another version of the same story, Mami, at the urging of Ea herself, finished the creative process. The mother womb, the creatress of destiny, in pairs she completed them. The forms of the people Mami formed. These creation stories express concepts deriving from earlier modes of the worship of female fertility. The primal force in nature is the sea, the water, the mystery of the egg, which opens to create new life. Snake goddess, sea goddess, virgin goddess, and goddess molding humans out of clay, it is the female who holds the key to the mystery. On the other hand, we should note here that while the creative act is performed by the goddess, the male god frequently is decisively involved in initiating the process of creation. The recognition of the necessary cooperation of the male and the male principle in the process of creation seems to be firmly established in Sumerian and Akkadian mythology. With the domestication of animals and the development of animal husbandry, the function of in the process of procreation became more apparent and was better understood. At a later stage of development, we find the mother goddess associated with a male partner, either a son or a brother, who assists her in the fertility by mating with her. In myth and ritual, the male god is young and he may have to die in order for rebirth to take place. It is still the great goddess who creates life and governs death, but there is now a more pronounced recognition of the male part in procreation. So the sacred marriage or hieros gamos and similar annual rites, which were celebrated widely in many different societies in the 4th and 3rd millennium BC, expressed these beliefs. Not until the goddess had mated with the young god and his death and rebirth had taken place could the annual cycle of the seasons begin. The sexuality of the goddess is sacred and confers the blessings of fertility to earth and to the people who through their ritual observances please her. The ritual of the sacred marriage took many forms and was widely practiced in Mesopotamia, Syria, Canaan, and the Aegean. Among its many complex meanings is that it transformed the all-encompassing fertility of the mother goddess into the more domesticated fertility of the goddess of cultivated grain. There is also in these myths from the third and second millennia BC evidence that a new concept of creation enters religious thinking. Nothing exists unless it has a name. The name means existence. The gods receive their existence through name giving, as do humans. The Babylonian creation epic in the elite begins as follows. Firm ground below had not been called by name. Not but primordial Apsu, the begetter, and Tiamat, she who bore them all, their co-mingled as a single body, when no gods whatever had been brought into being, uncalled by name, their destinies undetermined. Then it was that the gods were formed within them. Here, fertility principle, primarily lodged in the mother goddess, requires the co-mingling with the male begetter before the cycle of birth can begin. But before creation can take place, there must be a concept, something within them, which will later be named or called to life. Similarly, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the goddess Aruru is called by the other gods and commanded to fashion a man, a double for Gilgamesh. Create now his Aruru heard this, a double of Anu he conceived within her. Aruru washed her hands, pinched off clay, and cast it on the step. On the step she created Valiant Enkidu. In another Akkadian myth, the god Enlil draws the likeness of a dragon on the sky, which then comes to life. As the Assyriologist Georges Constantino observes, the creating god mentally defines the nature to be of his creation. It has taken final shape in his imagination and he has given it a name. He draws shape whereby it acquired almost complete life. Naming his profound significance in the old Mesopotamian belief system, the name reveals the essence of the bearer. It also carries magic power. The concept lives on through the millennia in myth and fairy tale. The person who can guess the name of another acquires power over him, as in the German fairy tale Rumpelstiltskin. A person newly endowed with power is renamed. Thus, the god Marduk in the Babylonian creation myth is given 50 names as tokens of his power. We will discuss later how this power of names and naming is used in the book of Genesis. What is important to observe here is that the concept of creation has changed at a certain period in history from being merely the acting out of the mystic force of female fertility to being a conscious act of creation, often involving God figures of both sexes. This element of consciousness expressed in the idea, the concept, the name of that which will create, made a reflection of an altered human consciousness due to significant changes in society. The time when these concepts first appear is the time when writing has been invented and with its history. Record keeping and the elaboration of symbol systems demonstrate the power of abstraction. The name recorded enters history and becomes immortal. This must have appeared as magical to contemporaries. Writing, record keeping, mathematical thinking, and the elaboration of various symbol systems altered people's perception of their relation to time and space. It should not surprise us to find that religious myths reflected these changes in consciousness. From the point of view of this study, which focuses on the development and institutionalization of patriarchal gender symbols, we should notice that the symbolification of the capacity to create, as in the concept of naming, simplifies the move away from the mother goddess as the sole principle of creativity. It is, so to speak, a higher level of thinking to move away from the common sense observable facts of female fertility and conceptualize a symbolic creativity which can be expressed in the name quote unquote, the concept. It is not a very big step from that to the concept of, quote unquote, the creative spirit of the universe. Yet, precisely that step forward in the ability to make abstractions and create symbols that can stand for abstract concepts is an essential precondition to move toward monotheism. Until people could imagine an abstract, unseen, unknowable power which embodied such a creative spirit, they could not reduce their numerous anthropomorphic, contentious gods and goddesses to the one God. The transitional stage is expressed in those creation myths which describe the creative spirit as the god of the air, the god of the winds, the god of thunder, who creates by bringing to life mechanically fashioned beings through his breath of life. It seems to me likely that historic changes in society, which emphasize kingship and military leadership, would lead men to reach for a male god symbol to embody that newly realized principle of symbolic creativity. As we will see, that process continues for a period of more than 1,000 years and culminates in the book of Genesis. The fact that in Egyptian belief, generativity was embodied in the male goddess Osiris as early as the 3rd millennium BC supports the thesis that religious beliefs reflected societal conditions. Here, the early establishment of strong kingship, in which the pharaohs reigned as gods incarnate, was reflected in the power and dominance of the male gods in the creation myth. The next major change observable in creation myths occurs contemporaneously with the rise of archaic states under strong kings. Sometime beginning in the 3rd millennium BC, the figure of the mother goddess is replaced from the head of the pantheon of gods. She gives way to a male god, usually the god of wind and air or the god of thunder, who more and more as time progresses comes to resemble an earthly king of the new kind. In this process of transformation, the former earth goddesses now appear as daughters and wives of vegetation gods. The Mesopotamian Damkina, lady of the earth, becomes the consort of Ea or Enki, god of the waters. Similar transformations take place in the mother goddesses Ninlil, Nintu, Ninhursag, and Aruru. The earliest Sumerian description of the pantheon of gods show the heaven god and the earth goddess Ki presiding in unison over the other gods. Out of their union springs the air god Enlil. His chief place of worship is Nippur, a city-state in constant conflict with Eridu, whose deity is Enki. In circa 2400 BC, the leading gods are listed in order as An, heaven, Enlil, air, Ninhursag, queen of the mountain, and Enki, lord of the earth. Ninhursag may represent the earth goddess Ki, now relegated to a minor position. In still later texts, circa 2000 BC, she is mentioned last after Enki. The Sumerologist Samuel Noah Kramer explains this change in the theogony as the result of the increasing influence of priests who are associated with particular temples and particular cities and their rulers. These priests now record the ancient myths in such a way as to serve political ends. Kramer noted the absence from the list of Namu, the mother goddess, formerly hailed as creator of the universe and mother of the gods. He thinks her powers were transformed to her son Enki in an apparent attempt to justify this bit of priestly piracy. The relationship of societal change and changes in the theogony became even more explicit later. In the Enuma Elish, to which we alluded earlier, written 1100 BC, chaos in the form of the life-giving Tiamat is confronted by rebellious primitive gods who wish to create order. A terrible battle ensues in which the rebellious gods are led by a young god who then physically destroys Tiamat and creates out of her carcass the earth and the heavens. The gods now also slay Tiamat's husband, and from his blood mixed with soil, they create humankind. It is highly significant that the young god who slays Tiamat in the epic is Marduk, the god worshipped in the city of Babylon. Marduk first emerges during the time of Hammurabi of Babylon, who has made his city-state dominant in the Mesopotamian region. In Enuma Elish, written down some 600 years later, some of the old mythical material is transformed into a major theological system. The young god Marduk now is elevated to supreme power among the gods. In a similar process, in a period of their political dominance, the Assyrians told their creation myth by putting their national god Ashur in the center of their story, as one scholar observes. The rise of two national gods, Marduk and Ashur, to positions of supreme power in the world of gods, reflect the eventual crystallization of Mesopotamia into the two rival national states, each under an absolute monarch. Power and decision were now centered in Marduk and Ashur, the other gods acting as their agents or intercessors with them. In Canaanite mythology, the young storm god Baal moves to the head of the pantheon, when in conflict with his adversary Mot, the god of death. He descends to the underworld. All vegetation ceases on earth. Baal's sister and consort, Anath, searches for him everywhere. When she finds his dead body, she buries him and engages in a fierce battle with Mot, in which she kills him. She cuts up Mot's body, crushes it, winnows it in a sieve, grinds it in a mill, and scatters it over the fields. This symbolic treatment of Mot as though he were grain helps restore fertility to the earth. When Baal returns from the dead for further battles and eventual victory over Mot, Anat, who had in the myth shown all the ancient qualities of the mother goddess, fierceness in battle, strength, and the power to grant fertility, now is overshadowed by him who has become the supreme god and giver of life. We have earlier discussed how kings take over the temple of the supreme deity. Thus, in Lagash, in the earliest period of kingship, Lugalanda appointed himself chief administrator of the temple of the god Ningirsu, and his wife Baranamtara, chief administrator of the temple of the goddess Ba. In a later period, such as the reign of Hammurabi, when the kingship is already well established and embraces a vast realm, the king embodies some of the divine leadership. It is as though there were a continuous flow of power, sacredness, and energy between God and king. It is not surprising that in the process of the mother goddess not only loses her supremacy, but generally becomes domesticated and transformed into the supreme god's wife. Yet at the same time, in some mysterious way, she separates off and acquires a new life and new identity in a variety of forms, which continue to have force in popular religion. We will discuss that process below. The changing position of the mother goddess, her dethroning, takes place in many cultures and at different times, but usually it is associated with the same historical processes. In Elam, the mother goddess reigns supreme in the 3rd millennium BC, but becomes secondary in importance to her consort Humbam at a later date. The same development occurred at different times in Anatolia, in Crete, and in Greece. In Egypt, where the male god early predominates, we can also find traces of a still earlier predominance of the goddess. Isis, as the throne woman, embodied the mysterious power of kingship. As E.O. James puts it, as such, she was the source of vitality, before she became the prototype of the life-giving mother and faithful wife. A closer look at Hittite society and its development provides us with a good case study for the transition from matrilineal kinship and royal succession to patrilineal kinship and succession and its reflections in religion. Hittite society flourished between 1700 through 1190 BC in ancient Anatolia. It combined elements of the more ancient Hatti culture with those of an Indo-European people who overwhelmed the region probably at the end of the 3rd millennium BC. Early Hittite governance was based on a system in which the right of succession lodged in the Tawanana, the prince's sister. The Hittite royal house practiced brother-sister marriage. Later, when brother-sister marriage was outlawed, the Tawanana continued as priestess and held the power of succession. This now meant that the brother's son would succeed to the throne. Early in the 2nd millennium, the first strong Hittite king, Hattusilis the first, not only challenged the traditional rule of succession by appointing his grandson over his son as his successor, which brought him in conflict with his aunt, but he also abolished the office of Tawanana and proclaimed himself chief priest. He also began to appoint royal princesses as priestesses in the goddesses' sanctuaries. We have seen earlier how this same process occurred in Sumer during the formation of archaic states. But the decree of Hattusilis I did not abolish the strong matrilineal tradition and the rule of succession that the Tawanana's brother's son shall be king persisted. Hattusilis' grandson continued Hittite expansion by invading Babylon, but he was assassinated and the kingdom was plagued by internal familial conflict and palace murders over the issue of succession. These coincided with Hurrian invasion and conquest of most of Syria. A royal son-in-law, Telepinu, who became a king, probably in line with the old matrilineal custom of accepting a Marian in man to the royal succession in the absence of an heir, tried to lay down patriarchal succession in his edict circa 1525 BC. The edict specified that if there were no sons available for the succession, the husband of the first ranking daughter should become king. The edict also describes the previous period of bloodshed, which seemed to have been due to the transition from one kinship system to the other. It certainly testifies to the strength of the tradition of matrilineal succession. The tradition was strong enough to survive for another 150 years, during which a new dynasty came to power. It was reflected in the quarrel of King Tuthaliah with his sister, whom he accused of having used witchcraft. The quarrel was resolved by a compromise by which the king's son succeeded to the kingship, while the king's daughter became Tawanana and exercised the office of the priestess to the sun goddess. By this arrangement, the right of succession was subtly shifted to the king. It was the last time in Hittite history that a brother-sister pair thus shared temporal and religious power. That these internal struggles weakened the government can be seen from the fact that the country's enemies brought it to near extinction. In 1380 BC, a strong king, Suppiluliumus I, ushered in the new Hittite period of empire building, which for nearly 100 years would make the Hittite kingdom rival Egypt and Babylon in grandeur. He reestablished Hittite hegemony over Syria by conquering the Hurrians and extending his realm to Damascus. Most likely, his success in finally abolishing the office of the Tawanana as the embodiment of the right of matrilineal succession is integrally connected with his strong kingship and success as an empire builder. Suppilulimus I transformed the first transformed the Tawanana office by installing his queen in it, thus retaining the form while transposing the content. Henceforth, succession rights were vested in the king, whose wife, not sister or daughter, was invested by his power in her office as Tawanana and priestess, both now offices divested of their major and inheritable powers. Suppiluliumus I pacified conquered areas by installing figurehead kings, who became his vassals, and to whom he married his daughters. We have seen this practice followed by for similar dynastic reasons in Sumer and in Marai. It is a practice which significantly alters the relationship of women to political power by making them tools of male power decisions and making their power dependent on their sexual and reproductive services to a particular male. The son of Suppiluliumus I and his grandson followed in his footsteps by extending Hittite power to the Aegean and to Syria. Once again, after the grandson's death, there ensued a battle over the succession, which ended with the usurpation of the throne by the king's brother, Hadasilas III. This king, who signed treaties of friendship and mutual assistance with Egypt and Babylon, brought the king to its greatest prosperity. He elevated his wife, Puduhepa, to co-ruler. It is significant that even then, the tradition of succession was so strong that the usurper king found it necessary to write an apology in which he credits his patron goddess Ishtar with inspiring his accession to power and with marrying his wife Puduhepa. Thus, the strong tradition of matrilineal succession and political power by women was transformed after 300 years of struggle into the office of a powerful queen serving as her husband's stand-in in a patriarchal society. Hittite power continued for another 50 years after Hadasilas III's death and was ended about 1200 BC by invasions of the Sea peoples, followed a few hundred years later by Assyrian conquest of the entire region. What remained of the Hittite Empire was a language, a strong artistic tradition, and hieroglyphic writing. For our purposes, however, there also remained the story of the transformation of the pantheon of gods and goddesses, which coincided with the political developments traced above. Carol F. Justice, who by comparative linguistic means has studied the transformation of the Hittite pantheon, has observed that the major god figures underwent a sex change in the process, which she interprets as symbolic of political and social changes of the two sexes in Hittite society. Prior to the Hittite conquest, the Indo-European inhabitants of the land had worshipped a pantheon of gods and goddesses headed by a sun god or Saul and a storm god Daiwu. Both figures occur in different forms in many ancient religions. The sun god is everywhere characterized as wide-seeing, all-encompassing. His chariot is drawn by horses across the sky. The storm god, Sanskrit, Dyaus, Patar, Greek Zeus, Homeric Zeus, Pater, Latin Jupiter, is characterized as shining, father, begetter of men, progenitor. He is associated with the weather and with lightning. Hattic inhabitants of the region also worshipped a sun goddess, Astan, and a storm god, Taru. The Hittites, synthesizing elements of both cultures, worshipped a sun god, Istanu, who was a revised version of the sun goddess Estan, now changed to a male. This male god was in the new Hittite Empire worshipped as father and king. In hymns celebrating him, he is credited with establishing the custom and law of the land, and he is addressed as father and mother of the oppressed. His epithet may well be an allusion to his origin in both a female and a male deity. His divine kingship parallels that of the Sumerian Marduk and the Assyrian Ashur, deities who ascend to heavenly kingship with the establishment of a strong kingdom on earth. In a somewhat later Hittite period, the sun goddess Arena is worshipped as queen. She echoes back to the ancient goddess Estan, who was associated with the underworld, but now her cult symbols associates her with the sun. Significantly, Queen Kuduhepa, who was co-ruler with her husband at the time when patriarchal rule was firmly institutionalized, addressed this goddess as Queen of Heaven and Earth. At a time when the Tawanana is the wife of the king and no longer incorporates the royal line of succession, this shift in the function of the female goddess, now hailed as patron and protector of king and queen, may well serve to give heavenly legitimacy to an earthly reversal of power. It will not surprise us to learn that in a still later period, the sun goddess Arena has become Hepat, the consort of the sun god, who has meanwhile himself become dethroned by the storm god Sistah. The development here is similar to the pattern we have noticed elsewhere of the sun god being replaced by the storm god. Harold Justice defines the significance of these changes as follows. Not until the Hittite king assumed the Tawanana's religious authority as well as the primary right of his own son in the succession did he in fact control the Hittite land. Attempts to incorporate female spheres of authority were progressive. Shifts in the pantheon from sun goddesses Estan, the queen, to sun god Istanu, the king, to the new king in heaven, the storm god, reflect the gradual absorption of female rights by patriarchal structure. What we know of religious practices in the ancient Near East comes to us in the form of literary and religious documents preserved in clay tablets. These are overwhelmingly the product of priestly scribes associated with various temples or palaces. Even if we disregard ideological distortions and alterations in basic texts in the interest of a particular divinity or royal personage, we must understand that what we are analyzing here are those myths and texts transmitted and approved by a societal elite. The recorded versions of the myths and theogonies may have enjoyed widespread popular support, but we cannot be sure of that. The shift from the mother goddess to the thunder god may be more prescriptive than descriptive. It may tell us more about what the upper class of royal servants, bureaucrats, and warriors wanted the population to believe than what the population actually did believe. For in the very centuries in which we have been tracing changes in the direction of patriarchal god figures, the cult of certain goddesses flourished and diffused even more widely. The great goddess may have been demoted in the pantheon of the gods, but she continued to be worshipped in her manifold manifestations. All Assyriologists testify to her enormous popularity and the persistence of her cult in various guises in all the major cities of the Near East for nearly 2,000 years. The ancient mother goddesses absorbed the features and characteristics of similar goddesses in other regions as their cults diffused in the wake of conquest and territorial occupations. The Egyptian Isis offers an example of the diffusion and synthesizing aspect of great goddess worship. As the throne woman in the earliest period, she had embodied the sacred kingship and mysterious knowledge. Later, she became the prototype of the mother and faithful wife. She taught her brother's spouse Osiris the secrets of agriculture and restored his dismembered body to life. In the Hellenistic period, she was worshipped as the Magnamator of Western Asia and the Greco-Roman world. In other instances, the great goddess herself became transformed. In the earlier period, her attributes had been all-encompassing. Her sexuality connected with birth, death, and rebirth. Her power both for good and evil, for life and death. Her aspects, those of mother, warrior, protector, and interceder with the dominant male god. In the later periods, her various qualities were split off and embodied in separate goddesses. Her warrior aspect diminished, probably relegated to the male god, and her qualities as a healer were more and more stressed. This does appear to reflect a change in concepts of gender in the societies in which she was worshipped. Her erotic aspect was emphasized in the Greek goddess Aphrodite and in the Roman goddess Venus. Her quality as healer and protector of women in childbirth became embodied in the goddess of Melita in Assyria and in Artemis, Aletheia, and Hera in Greece. The cult of Asherah in Canaan, which coexisted for centuries with the cult of Yahweh and which is frequently condemned in the Old Testament, may have been due to the association of the goddess with protection in childbirth. To discuss her many properties and the forms in which she was worshipped would require a separate chapter. Statuaries in her likeness and with her symbols are widespread, testifying to her popularity. Many of these were found not only in temples but in homes, indicating the important place of her worship in popular region. We may be justified in regarding the extraordinary persistence of fertility and goddess cults as an expression of female resistance to the predominance of male god figures. There is as yet no hard evidence to prove this speculation, but it is difficult to explain the persistence of these female cults in any other way. In the second millennium BC, men and women stood in the same relation to the mysterious and awesome forces represented by the gods and goddesses. Gender distinctions were not yet used to explain the causes of evil and the problem of death. The cause of pain and human suffering was the sinfulness of men and women and their neglect of their duty toward the gods. And the kingdom of death in Mesopotamian belief was as likely to be governed by a female supernatural as not. The great philosophical questions, who creates human life, who speaks to God, could still be answered human beings, men and women. No matter how degraded and commodified the reproductive and sexual power of women was in real life, their essential equality could not be banished from thought and feeling as long as the goddesses lived and were believed to rule human life. Women must have found their likeness in the goddess as men found theirs in the male gods. There was a perceived and essential equality of human beings before the gods, which must have radiated out into daily life. The power and mystery of the priestess was as great as that of the priest. As long as women still mediated between humans and the supernatural, they might perform different functions and roles in society than those of men, but their essential equality as human beings remained unassailed. Various representations of major goddess figures, from the earliest fertility goddess to the powerful, multifaceted Inanna or Ishtar. Numbers 6 and 7 represent a ceremony, probably a religious festival, in which the produce of the fields and of herds is offered to the goddess and her priestess. The fertility of fields and herds is represented by the images in the bottom row of the vase from Europe. Note the difference in status of the priestess, who is fully and formally clothed, and the bearers of the offerings, who are naked. There is another that shows the goddess with her insignia among the other gods, and the goddess bestowing her blessing as her sponsorship on worshiping dignitaries and on kings. The power of kingship is thus symbolically represented as deriving from the blessing and sponsorship of the goddess. The goddess Ishtar, in her capacity as a warrior, dressed in warrior's garb and standing on a lion. Notice in this late cylinder seal the association of the goddess with the fruit-bearing tree. And then there's the ruler of Larsa or Gudia holding a container, spewing forth water as a symbol of his power to make the land fertile. A somewhat later representation from the palace of the king Zimmerlim of Marai, showing the goddess in an identical pose holding a similar vessel. As can be seen in the side view, the hollowed out statue could be filled with water from the back, which could, at the appropriate moment, spew forth, quote unquote, miraculously. Although we cannot here demonstrate a sequential development by means of pictorial representations, we do know from prayers and hymns that the power of the goddess to make the water flow and the land fertile had been celebrated for hundreds of years before the rulers symbolically appropriated it. I'll add the pictures later on after the live, but the illustrations here in 14 and 15 show women worshipers from the third millennium BC. The strong, dignified renditions of their bodies and faces and their individualized expressions are quite remarkable. These women are represented with dignity and showing personal characteristics which, since they are not royal personages, may indicate a generally respectful attitude toward women in society. In European art after classical antiquity, we do not find such individualized representations of lower class persons until the early Renaissance. Illustration 16 comes from an Anatolia and shows a spinning woman mother with a male child who is holding up a stylus. On a similar relief from the same time and place, which is not shown here, we see a woman who is seated holding a child on her lap who holds up a tablet and a falcon. In that representation, the woman's pose and expression make it clear she is the boy's mother. These pictures indicate the distance we have come from an earlier period when women as well as men were scribes in the service of the temples. Now the woman may be proud of her learned son while she pursues the feminine skills of the weaver. Identified as that of a hierodule of the goddess Astarte, because her face is unveiled in public as she displays herself in the open window of a building, she is considered to represent a prostitute or possibly a religious sexual servant. The fact that this representation is part of a piece of furniture, namely a bedstead, underscores its implicit sexual meaning. Illustrations 18 through 23 shows various representations of the tree of life. These are arranged chronologically and derived from different places. We should notice the association of the tree with mythological creatures. In 20 and 21, the figures distinctly represent warriors, possibly one of them the king. We see the tree of life symbol as central to the composition. King's servants or various mythical creatures are shown watering or pollinating the tree. The fact that this symbol is central to palace art and also appears on cylinder seals would indicate that it was widely dispersed and recognized. The later the period, the more the symbol becomes disassociated from a realistic representation of tree or plant and from its association with the life-giving symbol of water. In 19 and 21, which come from the palace of King Ashur Narsapal II of Assyria, we can see it in its most stylized and decorative form. The fact that in this place, which is overwhelmingly decorated with reliefs showing many pursuits, such as war and conquest and lion hunting, the king is shown in the act of caring for and fertilizing the tree of life. Adds significance to the symbol. Notice the gesture of all the male figures in the relief pointing toward the tree 20 and 21, and the winged bird, representing divine power hovering over the tree. We interpret it as a symbolic representation of the power of creating life, now firmly and finally in the hands of the king and not of the goddess. Illustration 22, from a large relief from the palace of King Ashurbanipal II of Assyria, shows the victory banquet of the king. It is noteworthy because it features the queen as an active participant at a public ceremony. There are various servants and entertainers, male and female, in evidence. The tree of life, with its symbol of fertility, the date or the pomegranate, is prominently featured. Illustration 23 shows King Xerxes enthroned with servants, retinue, and standard bearers. In his upraised right hand, he holds a flower. It is a symbolic flower we have seen earlier in connection with the tree of life. Illustrations 25, 26, and 27 represent portions of Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling and depict the story of the creation of man and of woman and the story of the fall. The power to give life is now represented by the bearded patriarchal God, the Father. The tree has become the tree of the forbidden fruit. The tempter is now the snake, long associated with the goddess. The powerful images of Michelangelo more clearly represent the metaphors for gender held in the Judeo-Christian tradition than do the glosses and explanations. Adonai may be sexless and invisible, but in the popular imagination, it is the bearded Father God who creates life. And the first command to the fallen woman is that there shall be enmity between her and the snake. Just a second. Okay, chapter 8, the patriarchs. Western civilization draws many of its leading metaphors and definitions of gender and morality from the Bible. Before we consider these leading symbols, which have defined and shaped so much of our cultural heritage, we need to gain some understanding of the culture out of which the Bible came. And we need to survey, however briefly, the historic evidence within the Bible for the position of women in Hebrew society. A study of the Old Testament in its entirety would be far beyond the scope of this work. I have chosen to concentrate on the book of Genesis because it has provided the leading and most significant symbols concerning gender. The use of the Bible as a historic document rests on a solid scholarly foundation, which has in the past 100 years established a close correlation between the archaeological discoveries of ancient Near East cultures and the biblical narrative. The book of Genesis combines poetry and prose pieces, some of mythical, some of folklore's character. It is by now taken for granted that earlier Sumero-Babylonian, Canaanite, and Egyptian cultural materials were adapted and transformed by the writers and redactors of the Bible, and that contemporary practices, laws, and customs of neighboring peoples were reflected in its narrative. In using the biblical text as a source for historical analysis, one must be aware of the complexity of its authorship, its purposes, and its sources. The older tradition of ascribing the authorship of the book of Genesis to Moses has given way, on the basis of massive internal evidence established by modern form criticism, to the acceptance of the documentary hypothesis. It holds that the Bible, whether one wishes to believe it divinely inspired or not, was the work of many hands. The writing of the book of Genesis spanned a period of roughly 400 years, from the 10th century BC to the 5th. It is now generally accepted that there are three main traditions of authorship, and that many of the sources represent a far more ancient tradition, which the redactors reinterpreted and incorporated in the narrative. The writing down of material which for centuries had been orally transmitted, and the creation of a coherent story leading up to the Davidic monarchy was begun after the division of the kingdom. The narrative known as J, for the use of Yahweh and for its Judean origin, is commonly believed to have been composed in the southern kingdom of Judah in the 10th century BC. The second author, called E for Elohist, became because of the way he refers to the deity, and because he is thought to represent the Ephraimite tradition, probably worked in the northern state of Israel somewhat later. Third, there is the P tradition, which includes and reinterprets the J and E narratives, while there is considerable controversy over the dating of P. Scholars agree that we are dealing not with an individual, but with a school of priestly redactors in Jerusalem who may have worked for hundreds of years and completed the work sometime in the 7th century BC. The book of Deuteronomy, which is a product of the 7th century BC, is considered to be a separate creation. The final fusion of the various elements in the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, occurred around 450 BC under the direction of Ezra and Nehemiah, when the kingdom of Judah was under Persian domination. It represented the canonization of Jewish law and the supreme achievement of Jewish religious thought in the ancient period. In order to understand the meaning of the vast cultural transformation represented by the creation of Jewish monotheism, we need to keep in mind the social conditions which are reflected in the book of Genesis. The patriarchal tribes of the earliest period described in Genesis lived as had their ancestors as nomads or semi-nomads in the desert. They raised sheep, goats, and cattle and engaged in seasonal agriculture. At various times, they also lived on the outskirts of cities under the protection of sedentary people, but keeping their own customs separate from those of their hosts. Their cohesiveness and survival depended on strong tribal ties. The smallest unit was the patriarchal family, which was comprised of a man, his wife, his sons, and their wives and children, his unmarried daughters, and his servants. Several families formed a clan. Mispacha, they aided each other economically and met for religious peace. A group of clans claiming a common ancestor and recognizing a common leader united in a tribe. The tribes recognized the bond of blood, which imposed upon them the responsibility for blood vengeance. That is, an injury to a member of the tribe had to be avenged by death of his attacker or by the death of a member of the attacker's family. Among nomads, in the absence of a regular judicial system, This form of retribution protected the rights and integrity of the tribes. Members of the tribes had an obligation to care for and protect their weaker members. While some of the tribal members were richer in cattle than others, there were no great economic differences among them. Among desert nomads, a lone individual cannot survive. Thus, hospitality to a stranger was a basic and sacred rule. Most scholars date the patriarchal period of biblical history to the first half of the second millennium BC. There is useful historical evidence available for the conditions prevalent among West Shemitic tribes in the documents from the Royal Archives of Merai, dating from circa 1800 BC, which illuminate actual conditions in Abraham's homeland of Haran. Documents from the city of Nuzi have also provided scholars with much information about family life, which has enabled them better to understand and interpret the customs reflected in Genesis. In Haran what Abraham had his first encounter with God, who made a covenant with him. It is this covenant which will set apart the descendants of Abraham as God's chosen people. I will discuss its symbolic significance in the next chapter. Here we should note that this mythical event marks the beginning of the Jewish religious experience and provides the energized idea which will enable this people to survive for the subsequent 4,000 years despite diaspora and frequent persecutions and in the absence of a homeland. Scholars generally regard Moses as the founder of Jewish monotheism and the Decalogue as its basic law. In the approximately 400 years between Abraham and Moses, the Hebrew tribes, although they were pledged to the worship of Yahweh as their only God, continued the observance of idols in the form of household gods. The only ritual that united them was male circumcision and the prohibition against human sacrifice, as embodied in the story of Isaac. The story of Joseph and his brothers tells of the migration of famine-stricken Hebrews in Egypt, where they dwelt peacefully until a new Pharaoh, who was ill-disposed toward them, enslaved them. The exodus from Egypt, which the biblical story describes so vividly, has been dated by archaeological evidence as falling in the reign of Ramses II, or circa 1290 through 24 BC. Following upon the Exodus, the biblical story tells how Moses leads the people through the desert for 40 years and how Mount Sinai is given the tables or the tablets of the law by Yahweh. Moses' revelation of the law to the people and his destruction of the golden calf, symbol of idol worship, are the crucial points in the narrative. Yahweh's covenant with Moses confirms and reinforces all the earlier covenants and makes of Israel an entity united by a common belief and a common law. Moses dies without seeing the promised land. It is his appointed successor, Joshua, who leads the Israelites there. Scholars believe that the conquest of Canaan under Joshua was completed by 1250 BC, which also marks the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age in Palestine. The semi-nomadic tribes conquering Canaan became sedentary in a region which had been sparsely settled due to poor soil and scarce water supply. They were able to overcome these environmental obstacles with technological innovations using iron, the storage of water in lined cisterns, deeper cultivation with iron-tipped farm tools, and the development of terracing to preserve water. They also must have experienced large-scale catastrophes brought on by war and by various epidemics, which are described in the Bible as plagues or pestilence. The combined pressure of the need for agricultural labor in settling a desert environment and the concurrent loss of population due to wars and epidemic crisis in the very period when the rudimentary principles of Jewish religious thought came into being, may explain the biblical emphasis on the family and on woman's procreative role. In such a demographic crisis, women would most likely have agreed to a division of labor which gave their maternal role primacy. Permanent settlement in villages and small towns brought changes in the concept of leadership, which shifted from the tribe to the clan. In the period of Judges 1125 to 1020 BC, tribes sometimes took joint action and sometimes acted independently, but intertribal attachments were generally weak. Authority was wielded by elders, from among whom judges were chosen during periods of crisis. In this period, when national consciousness was essentially not yet in existence, a common religious and cultural tradition formed the bond between the tribes. The period of warfare between Israelite tribes and Canaanites, which took place while the entire region was under Philistine dominance, is described in one of the oldest segments of the Old Testament, the Song of Deborah, Judges 4 through 5. It is one of only 5 instances in the narrative in which a woman is shown in a leadership position and heroic role. Deborah is described as a prophetess and a judge who inspires Barak to rally the troops in resistance to the Canaanites led by Sisera. In a passage quite exceptional in the Bible literature, she is shown to assume actual leadership over men. And Barak said unto her, If thou wilt go with me, then I will go. But if thou wilt not go with me, then I will not go. And she said, I will surely go with thee, notwithstanding the journey that thou takest shall not be for thy honor, for the Lord will give Sisera over into the hands of a woman. And Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh. Judges 4, 8 through 9. Deborah's prophecy comes true when Sisera is killed by Jael, the wife of Heber, who lures him into her tent by an offer of hospitality, and while he is sleeping, drives a tent pin into his temple with a hammer. For this heroic deed, she is lauded in the Song of Deborah in these words: Blessed above women shall Jael be, the wife of Heber the Kenite. Above women in the tent shall she be blessed. Judges 5:24. Although clearly the miracle is the Lord's, who enables even a woman to kill a warrior, the passage is remarkable in its celebration of female strength, both moral, Deborah, and physical, Jael. The Israeli victory and the need for unity against the Philistines strengthened the tendencies toward strong leadership among the 12 tribes. The first offer of kingship was made to Gideon after his victory over the Midianites, but he declined it, 1110 BC. Later, the tribes, as a result of their repeated defeats by the Philistines, became convinced of the need for unity and made Saul king. Saul united the tribes, formed a standing army, and defeated the Philistines. Quite similar to the Mesopotamian military leaders who ascended to kingship, he raised members of his own family to important positions and hoped to make his office hereditary. But he and his sons died in battle, and Saul was succeeded by David, who had earlier been made king of his own tribe, Judah. It was King David, 1004 to 965 BC, who welded the tribes into a national state and conquered vast territories between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. Like other archaic kings, David developed a bureaucracy and centralized administrative structure. He acquired royal land and palaces, conducted a census of the population, and made Jerusalem his capital. In moving the ark, the center of Israelite cultic life, to Jerusalem, he also made that city the center of Israelite religious life. After a bitter struggle for succession, David was followed by Solomon, who continued the strengthening and development of the monarchy. He made many treaties and dynastic marriages with formerly hostile neighbors, thus acquiring his vast harem. He created a group of royal merchants, equipped them with a fleet, and sent them on trade missions over a vast terrain. During his reign, the monarchy developed culturally and economically, but heavy taxation and increasing social stratification led to social unrest and finally a number of rebellions. After Solomon's death, the monarchy split into the two kingdoms of Judah and Israel. The dual monarchy was under constant threat from its bigger neighbors. The kingdom of Israel lasted only a little over 200 years and ended. After protracted warfare, when the Assyrians under Sargon II captured its capital, Samaria, in 722 BC and deported its entire population. Other important events from the perspective of religious development were the increasing spread of the cult of Baal and Asherah during the reign of King Ahab and his foreign-born wife Jezebel, and the reaction which followed upon it. Inspired by the prophets Elijah and Elisha, the sole worship of Yahweh was reestablished after a political coup and the assassination of 400 priests of Baal in 852 BC. Later religious revivals under the prophets Hosea, Amos, and Isaiah introduced into Yahwism the revolutionary idea of intolerance toward other gods and cults. The bull cult was outlawed, and the concept of fertility was more firmly affixed to Yahweh by Hosea's metaphor, which transposed the covenant idea by turning it into Yahweh's marriage with Israel, the bride. The prophets, in their inspired teaching, equated the sinfulness of Israel with whoring. Thus, patriarchal sexual metaphors became firmly embedded in religious thought. The kingdom of Judah, continuing the Davidic dynasty line, was successively invaded and fought against Egyptians, Phoenicians, Philistines, Moabites, Assyrians, and in 586 BC was finally subdued when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem, razed the temple, and deported the population. The fall of Jerusalem marked the end of Israel's political institutions. Henceforth, the survival of Israel depended on its adherence to the religion of Yahweh under the most adverse circumstances of exile, diaspora, and assimilation. This was made possible by the canonization of Jewish teaching in the Pentateuch accomplished under the prophet Ezra. The revolutionary aspect of Jewish monotheism was its absolute faith in the one invisible, ineffable God, its rejection of ritual as proof of holiness, and its demand instead on adherence to and the practice of ethical values. The great innovation of the synagogue as a place for religious assembly and the reading of scripture, the holy books, by any group of the faithful, instead of cultic practice monopolized by a sect of priests, made Jewish religion mobile, exportable, flexible, and communal. These were the features that made Jewish survival possible. The very same historic conditions that created the possibility of such a cultural and conceptual advance also influenced the way in which patriarchal concepts and ideas were structured into Jewish monotheism. Let us now turn to an examination of gender as defined in Israelite practice and thought. The tribes in Canaan. The tribes in Canaan lived in a pre-state society. The period of state formation in Israel did not occur circa 1050 BC until circa 1050 BC. If the same pattern of development were to occur in Palestinian society as a result of state formation, which we have earlier discussed in relation to Mesopotamian society, we might expect to find stricter regulation of female sexuality and increasing exclusion of women from public activity as the state becomes more powerful. The historical evidence seems to confirm this pattern, which we can here discuss only in outline. The stories of the patriarchs in Genesis offer some indications of a transition from matrilocal and matrilineal to patrilocal and patrilineal family organization in some of the tribes. The marriages, like the marriages of Leah and Rachel, the reference to a man leaving his father and mother and cleaving to his wife in Genesis 2:24 could be so interpreted as well. Jacob's 7 years of service to Laban for each of his daughters would conform to the practice of matrilocal marriage. The Assyriologist Kashgar has confirmed the existence of a form of marriage in early Mesopotamia in which the wife remained in her parents' house or more frequently tent, and the husband resided with her as either a permanent or occasional visitor. In the biblical narrative, matrilocal marriage is called Bina marriage. It allowed the woman greater autonomy and gave her the right to divorce, which patrilocal marriage, known as Baal marriage, abrogated that. Kashgar noted that this marriage form was superseded by patriarchal marriage. The story of Jacob's courtship and of his flight from Laban's house has been interpreted as implying the transition from matrilocality to patrilocality. Even before he came to Laban's house, Jacob was pledged to return to the house of his father. In carrying out his pledge, he had to overcome Laban's resistance and deception, which become more comprehensible when we understand that in a matrilocal society, Laban would have been entitled to and would have taken for granted Jacob's obligation to stay in his wife's locality. Rachel's theft of the teraphim can also be viewed in this light. This passage has long puzzled biblical scholars. Spicer interprets the teraphim as house gods and elucidates the passage by pointing out that according to Newsy documents, which have been found to reflect the social customs of Haran, the residence of Laban, possession of the house gods signified legal title to an estate. Thus, Rachel, believing that her father would deny her husband the legal share in his estate, took the teraphim. Spicer's interpretation is not inconsistent with the idea that in transferring the teraphim from her father's house to her husband's house, Rachel's actions symbolized the change from matrilocality to patrilocality. There is no question that the predominant family structure in the biblical narrative is the patriarchal family. Scholars have formed a fairly comprehensive picture of the social and family structure of the Hebrew society, which quite closely reflects that of Israel's Mesopotamian neighbors. In the earliest period, the patriarch had undisputed authority over the members of his family. The wife called her husband Baal, or master. He was similarly referred to as the Baal of his house or field. In the Decalogue, the wife is listed among the man's possessions, along with his servants, his ox, and his donkey. Exodus 20:17. In this period, the father also could sell his daughter into slavery or prostitution, which was later forbidden him. By the time of the monarchy, the father's power of life and death over his family members was no longer unlimited and unrestrained. In this respect, we note an improvement in the position of daughters over the earlier period. The great importance of the clan or mishpacha was reinforced by property arrangements. After the settlement period, family property was the predominant form of landholding. A family's property was defined by strict boundaries and usually included the ancestral tomb. Responsibility for the maintenance and preservation of this patrimony rested upon the patriarchal head of the family. The land belonged to the clan and was considered inalienable. That is, it could not be sold to anyone and could be transferred solely by inheritance. This inheritance usually fell to the eldest son. If there was no son, it could fall to the daughters, but they had to marry within their tribe. So their portion would not be transferred out. That's Numbers 27, 7 to 8 and 36, 6 through 9. If the owner dies childless, the inheritance went to his brother, uncle, or nearest kinsman. This is one of the foundations for the law of levirate, which binds a man to marry his widowed, childless sister-in-law in order to provide an heir for the deceased and to prevent alienation of the family property. The effect of these landholding patterns was to strengthen clan allegiance and to give great stability to the patriarchal tribal organizations from one generation to the other. This strong emphasis on the patriarchal control over clan property and the way in which it was structured into the very organization of Israelite society had a great impact on the position of women. Descent was reckoned patrilineally, with the eldest son succeeding the father in authority after the father's death. All the sons and their wives lived in the father's household until his death. The father contracted marriages for his children, in the case of sons, by paying a bride price. In the case of daughters, the father would furnish her dowry, which took the place of her share of the inheritance. Thus, the daughters of wealthy citizens had some measure of protection from abuse, since the return of her dowry in case of divorce might be to the economic disadvantage of her husband's family. The situation of the daughters of the poorer classes was no different from the unenviable situation of Mesopotamian poor women, except for the fact that in the monarchic period and after Jewish daughters were not enslaved, slavery being the lot of foreign women and of women of conquered groups. Also, in line with the generally much more humanitarian and lenient form of slavery in Israelite society, the female slave in Deuteronomy is released in the 7th year, as is the male slave, and must be furnished with supplies and animals from the master's flock. Deuteronomy 15, 12 through 13. All Israelite women were expected to marry and thus pass from the control of fathers and brothers to that of husbands and fathers-in-law. When the husband died before his wife, his brother or another male relative assumed control over her and married her. While the custom of the levirate has frequently been interpreted as a protective device for the widow, it speaks most strongly to the male concern for preserving the patrimony within the family. As they did in Mesopotamian societies, Hebrew men enjoyed complete sexual freedom within and outside of marriage. The biblical scholar Louis M. Epstein states that during the early periods, the husband had free sexual use of his concubines and slave women. If slave wives were his own, not given to him by his primary wife, he could present them to other members of the family after tiring of them himself. Polygamy, which was widespread among the patriarchs, later became rare except for royalty, and monogamous marriage became the ideal and the rule. Virginity was expected of the bride at the time of marriage, and the wife owed her husband absolute fidelity in marriage. Punishment for adultery was the death of both parties, Levi 20 and 10. But the Jewish wife had less protection against false accusations of adultery than did her Mesopotamian counterpart. Divorce was obtainable by the husband with an economic penalty, but it was never obtainable by the wife. In this respect, Jewish law was more detrimental to the wife than was Hammurabic law. The same was true for legislation pertaining to rape, in which Mesopotamian law afforded somewhat more protection to the woman. Jewish law forced the rapist to marry the woman he had raped and specifies that he may not divorce her. Implicitly, this forces a woman into an indissoluble marriage with her rapist. Deuteronomy 22:28 through 29. In marriage, the wife was expected to produce offspring, namely sons. Barrenness in a wife, which was interpreted to be failure to bear sons, was a disgrace to her and calls for divorce. Sarah, Leah, and Rachel, in despair when they find themselves barren, offer their slave women to their husbands in order that the slave woman's children be counted as their own. There is legal precedent for this custom in Hammurabic law, as there is for the different treatment accorded to the widow who is the mother of sons as against the barren widow. Adoption of kin. Strangers or even slaves was as prevalent in Hebrew as it was in other Near Eastern societies, as a means of providing a man with an heir in case of childlessness and assuring care for himself in old age. Or a man might add wives or concubines to his household if his first wife did not bear a son. This situation, which was similar to marriage customs in Mesopotamian society as reflected in the law codes, is described in the stories of Abraham and Hagar and Jacob and his two wives and two concubines. These complex familial arrangements also raise the question of succession as a problem. Since the law did not make clear, as did Hammurabic law, whether the eldest son of a slave woman would take precedence over the eldest son born to the legitimate wife. The case of Abraham and Hagar's son Ishmael is such a case. And the biblical story clearly indicates that God's intent is that his chosen people, Abraham's seed, shall be the progeny of Isaac, the son of the legitimate marriage, and not the progeny of Ishmael, the firstborn, who is the son of the slave concubine. There is precedent in Hammurabic law 170 for giving the heirship to the firstborn son of the first wife over the concubine's children, with the latter entitled to a lesser share in the inheritance if their father acknowledges them during his lifetime. In Ishmael's case, Abraham had already acknowledged him as his son, and yet God ordered him to expel Hagar and her son as Sarah desired. For it is through Isaac that your line shall be continued. Genesis 21:12. We may be entitled to consider this a strong divine endorsement of the primacy of the rights of legitimate sons. As we compare the legal and social position of women in Mesopotamian and Hebrew societies, we note similarities in the strict regulation of women's sexuality and in the institutionalization of a sexual double standard in the law codes. In general, the married Jewish woman occupied an inferior position to that of her counterpart in Mesopotamian societies. Babylonian women could own property, sign contracts, take legal action, and they were entitled to a share in the husband's inheritance. But we must also note a strong upgrading of the role of women as mothers in the Old Testament. The fifth commandment enjoins children to honor father and mother equally, and women are exalted as teachers of the young. In Proverbs, mothers and fathers are equally praised and honored in their role as parents, and the mother is described in positive terms only. This is quite in line with the general stress on the family as the basic unit of society, which we have also noted in Mesopotamian society at the time of state formation. So far, we have based our generalizations regarding the status of women on biblical law, as do most of the scholars in the field. But the law, as we have earlier discussed, reflects reality only in a tangential way, by what it assumes as a given and by what it defines as problematic. Otherwise, the law sets norms for desirable conduct, which usually do not represent actual societal conditions. We can get glimpses of actual practice in the biblical narrative by noting practices and values which are assumed as a given and therefore remain unexplained. The stories of Lot and Sodom and of the origin of the Benjamite War deal obliquely with the position of women. As told in Genesis 19, two angels in the form of two strangers come as visitors to Lot's house in Sodom. Lot makes a feast for them and invites them to stay overnight. The wicked men of Sodom surround the house and demand that he surrender the men to them, bring them out unto us that we may know them. Trying to calm them down, Lot steps outside the door of his house and addresses the Sodomites as follows: I pray you, my brethren, do not so wickedly. Behold, now I have two daughters that have not known man. Let me, I pray you, bring them out unto you, and do ye to them as is good in your eyes. Only to these men do nothing, for as much as they are come under the shadow of my roof. Genesis 19:7-8. So the mob storms into the house, but the angels strike the men of the mob with blindness. Then they warn Lot of the imminent destruction of the city of Sodom and tell him that he and his family would be saved, the Lord being merciful to him. The language here indicates that Lot is not being saved for his virtue, but because of God's mercy and because of Abraham. God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot dwelt. Genesis 19:29. The passage has been embarrassing to later commentators. Martin Luther praised Lot for upholding the law of hospitality and otherwise apologized for him. I will defend Lot and think he made his offer without sin. For knowing that the mob was not interested in them, he only tried to appease it and did not think he was exposing his daughters to any danger. Please. John Calvin, on the other hand, thought that Lot's great virtue was sprinkled with some imperfection. He does not hesitate to prostitute his daughters. Lot, indeed, is urged by extreme necessity, yet he is not free from blame. Later commentators have essentially followed these two lines of interpretation. Sarna comments that Lot's willingness to allow his daughters to be violated is utterly incomprehensible to the modern reader, even if allowance be made for the fact that the story reflects an age and a society in which daughters were the property of their fathers. I find it remarkable that E.A. Spicer, who annotates and comments on Genesis line by line, has no comment to offer regarding Lot's action. He criticizes Lot for lacking spontaneity and appearing servile in his hospitality, and describes the latent weakness in Lot's character in his being undecided, flustered, and ineffectual. The only hint of a comment on the incident is the sentence, true to the unwritten code, Lot will stop at nothing in his effort to protect his guests. Spicer follows Calvin's interpretation, and using a strictly textual analysis, Calvin seems quite justified in regarding Lot's offer of his daughter to the mob as merely an quote-unquote imperfection, since Yahweh, to whom the crimes of Sodom are so abhorrent that he destroys the city and all its inhabitants, nevertheless saves Lot. If we analyze this biblical story, we notice that Lot's right to dispose of his daughters, even so as to offer them to be raped, is taken for granted. It does not need to be explained, hence we assume it reflected a historic social condition. This assumption is strengthened by the telling of a somewhat similar story in Judges 19:1-21 and 25. A Levite living in Ephraim had a concubine from Judah, who played the harlot against him, and went away from her unto her father's house in Bethlehem in Judah. Judges 19:2. After 4 months had passed, the Levite went after her to speak kindly unto her, and after a prolonged stay at her father's house, he proceeded toward his home, taking her with him. He stopped in Gibeah in the land of Benjamin. but no one would offer him hospitality. Finally, he and his party were offered hospitality by a man from Ephraim. As the guests were being fed by their host, certain base fellows from the city surrounded the house and demanded that the Ephraimites surrender his guests to them, using almost the same words as in the Lot story. Bring forth the man that came into thy house, that we may know him. 19:22. The host refused, saying, Nay, my brethren, I pray you, do not so wickedly. Seeing that this man is come into my house, do not this wanton deed. Behold, here is my daughter, a virgin, and his concubine. I will bring them out now, and humble ye them, and do with them what seemeth good to you. But unto this man do not so wanton a thing. 19:23-24. The men would not listen to him, so the Levite laid hold on his concubine and brought her forth unto them. And they knew her and abused her all the night until the morning, and let her go at daybreak. The woman fell down at the doorstep and lay there. And her Lord rose up in the morning and found her. And when she did not answer his call, he took her upon his donkey and carried her body home. There he divided her body limb by limb into 12 pieces, and sent these throughout all the borders of Israel to arouse the Israelites to avenge this wicked deed. This narrative is followed by a dramatic account of the Israelite council, the decision to act for the surrender of the culprits in Gibeah, the refusal of the Benjamites to surrender them, and the ensuing Benjamite war. Throughout, it is clear that the insult and wickedness was the crime of inhospitability and the despoiling of the Levite's honor and property. The Levite's attitude toward his concubine, who in the Masoretic text is alternatively referred to as his wife, shows not only in his willingness to surrender her to the gang rape, but in his sleeping peacefully during the night of her ordeal. Nowhere in the text is there a word of censure toward him for his actions or toward the host, who offers up his virgin daughter to save his guest's life and honor. On the contrary, the text assumes that no explanation for such behavior is necessary. We should note, however, that in a section written in a later period, Leviticus 19:29, a father is specifically forbidden such an action. Profane not thy daughter to make her an harlot, lest the land fall into harlotry, and the land become full of lewdness. The earlier narrative continues, describing the total destruction of the Benjamites with the help and counsel of God. The Israelites kill all the men save 600 who flee into the wilderness, and they set fire to all the Benjamite cities. Before the outbreak of the war, the men of Israel had sworn, there shall not any of us give his daughter unto Benjamin to wife. 21:1. But now they realize that their pledge will mean the loss of a tribe of Israel. Wishing now to pacify the Benjamite remnant without violating their pledge, the Israelites solved the problem by going to war against the people of Jabesh Gilead, who had not responded to their call to arms against the Benjamites. In this war, the Israelites utterly destroyed every male and every woman that hath lain by man, Judges 21:11. That leaves 400 virgins, and the victors give these to the men of Benjamin as wives. The 200 remaining men of Benjamin who lack wives are commanded as follows. Behold, there is the feast of the Lord from year to year in Shiloh. Go and lie in the vineyards and see, and behold, if the daughters of Shiloh come out to dance the dances, then come ye out of the vineyards, and catch you every man his wife of the daughters of Shiloh, and go to the land of Benjamin. The Benjaminites follow this command and return with their new wives to rebuild their cities in order that a tribe not be destroyed out of Israel, 21:17. The account ends with a curious line, which one might interpret as casting some doubt on the righteousness of these proceedings. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. David Bacon, in a quite ingenious construction, interprets the theme of the Benjaminite War as a conflict and victory of patriarchy over matrilocality. He notes that the crime of the concubine was to remove herself from her husband's house to her father's house, and that evil is rectified, and the principle of patriarchy is affirmed by moving the 400 virgins of Jabesh Gilead to their quote-unquote husbands' homes. While his argument is intriguing, it cannot be satisfactorily proven. Other modern commentators are as silent on the treatment of the women in this passage as they are in the case of Lot's daughters. For example, Louis Epstein comments on both passages that from these stories we get a reflection of the revulsion which decent Jews felt to such an act of sodomy. In either case, the host offered his daughter for rape in exchange for the strangers, pleading that so vile a thing be not committed. It may be taken for granted, therefore, that from very ancient days, sodomy was considered among the Hebrews a severely immoral act. It may also be taken for granted that the honor, even the lives of women, was at the disposal of the men of their families, who regarded women as interchangeable instruments to be used for their procreative services. The men of Benjamin, whose wives and children had been killed, accept new wives from among enslaved or captured women and thus formed new families. In regard to legal rights in their persons or their bodies, there is no difference between free or slave women, nor between married women or virgins. The virgin daughters are as disposable as the concubine or the enslaved women captured in warfare. The passage in Judges further corroborates the historical evidence discussed in chapter 4 for the origins of slavery. Even in an internecine war between the tribes of Israel, the men are slain while the women are enslaved and raped. But the story of the Benjaminite War also demonstrates how wars are ended and enemies pacified by matrimonial arrangements, which are entirely under the control of the men of the tribe. One might regard the matrimonial exchange of the women of Jabesh Gilead as the usual enslavement and trading of the women of defeated enemies. But what of the daughters of Shiloh dancing at a feast of the Lord? They were not enemies, nor were their men conquered. They simply became pawns in a politically motivated effort at the pacification of a conquered enemy. A number of recent studies of the role of women in the Old Testament have tried to balance the overwhelming evidence of patriarchal domination by citing a few female heroic figures or women who take independent action of one sort or another. Phyllis Tribal has even asserted the existence of a quote-unquote counterculture to the patriarchal culture of Israel. In an interpretive essay which details the various expressions of patriarchal dominance in the Old Testament, another feminist scholar, Phyllis Bird, states correctly, as her evidence shows, that women are legally and economically deemed inferior to man in the biblical narrative, and that this reflected actual conditions in Hebrew society. Nevertheless, she asserts that man in the Old Testament recognizes woman as his opposite and equal, an assertion for which she offers precious little evidence. Similarly, John Otwell concludes the book, which is full of evidence to the contrary, with the assertion that the status of women in the Old Testament was high, and that they fully participated in the life of the community as wives and mothers. Those who regard the biblical narrative as showing advances for women point to the few heroic women mentioned in the narrative. speak of the role of the 5 female prophets mentioned in the text, stress the positive statements about women in Proverbs, and the erotic richness in praise of female sexuality in the Song of Songs. Unfortunately, the historical method does not support such a construction. The few women mentioned as having a respected or heroic role are quite overwhelmed by the many women described in servile, submissive, or subordinate roles. Clearly, the narrative, especially in the Song of Deborah and in the reference to the prophetess Huldah, lends support to the statement that women were recognized as prophetesses. But when we place these narratives in chronological order, it appears that this was so in the early period of Hebrew history, before or shortly after state formation. In the monarchy and thereafter, we do not find women in such roles. That would be in line with the general pattern we have noted for other Mesopotamian cultures. The Song of Songs is so difficult to interpret and bring into historical perspective that it seems unreasonable to make inferences from it as to the actual status of women. It needs to be treated as a literary creation. Since the identity of the woman in the song is unproven and highly controversial, it does not seem to me possible to use it as the basis for generalizations about the actual conditions of women in Hebrew society. We are on firmer ground in observing that the Old Testament text shows a gradual restriction of women's public and economic role, a lessening of her cultic function, and an ever increasing regulation of her sexuality as the Jewish tribes moved from confederacy to statehood. The laws I have discussed above derive by and large from the period of statehood. One might argue that Deuteronomic law is more favorable to women than Leviticus. The preoccupation with fighting the cult of Baal and Asherah, which persisted into the monarchic period and after, in which apparently had its greatest and most persistent strength among women, may explain the increasingly sharp regulation of women's behavior, the excessive language of censure against women's quote-unquote whoring in prophets, and finally their pervasive use of woman the whore for evils of sinning society. These subjects are close and lengthy study by biblical and literary experts. Here we can merely call attention to them. We will, in the next chapter, discuss the major religious and symbolic expressions of gender definition in the book of Genesis. It remains for us to observe here the way in which Hebrew society defined the cultic community, and that such definition not only excluded women in principle, but historically progressed from some participation by women to their exclusion completely. Louis Epstein points out that in the time of the patriarchs, men and women tended the flocks together, met at the watering wells, worshiped together in the temple, shared public celebrations, ate together, and attended weddings and funerals together. Segregation in the temple begins only with the second temple, which has a quote-unquote woman's court outside the temple, but in which both men and women congregated. Epstein qualified even that development by explaining that neither in practice nor in theory was this meant as a means of segregating the men from the women. The Jewish woman was part of the Jewish community. She should pray or study Torah, but she was not part of the cult either as functionary or administrator or as member of the cult fellowship. The temple had a woman's court in the sense that it had a public place for those who had no share in the ritual, where women assembled as part of the public. It was considered a primary religious duty of parents to teach their sons Torah, but there was no such obligation in regard to girls. Still, Epstein reports that as long as children were educated at home, girls were taught at the discretion of their parents. Until the 4th century AD, there was little interference with women's attendance at public gatherings for reading of and discourse on scripture. However, Formal education, which was instituted either in the 2nd or the 1st century BC, was probably limited to male students. I will show in the next chapter that from the outset, the covenant community was defined as a male community. This would almost sequentially have led to very few opportunities for women in cultic function, since in the Mesopotamian tradition, priestesses served female deities and priests served male deities. Yet Yahweh's gender identity was unspecified, especially in the earlier texts. What is significant for gender definitions in Western civilization is which metaphors, symbols, and explanations the writers of Genesis selected out of the many available sources. Similarly, what is significant for the present is not so much what the writers intended by each of their symbolic representations as what meaning future generations extracted from them. If, for example, Yahweh was not conceived or thought of as a gendered God, but rather as a principle which embodied male and female aspects, as some theologians have argued, this is significant only in showing us that there were available alternatives to the traditional patriarchal interpretation and that these alternatives were not chosen. The fact is that for over 2,500 years, the God of the Hebrews was addressed, represented, and interpreted as a male father God. No matter what other aspects he may have embodied, this was historically the meaning given to the symbol, and therefore this was the meaning which carried authority and force. This meaning became of the utmost significance in the way both men and women were able to conceptualize women and place them both in the divine order of things and in human society. There was therefore no inevitability in the emergence of an all-male priesthood. The prolonged ideological struggle of the Hebrew tribes against the worship of Canaanite deities, and especially the persistence of a cult of the fertility goddess, Asherah, must have hardened the emphasis on male cultic leadership and the tendency toward misogyny, which fully emerged only in the post-exilic period. Whatever the causes, the Old Testament male priesthood represented a radical break with millennia of tradition and with the practices of neighboring peoples. This new order under the all-powerful God proclaimed to Hebrews and to all those who took the Bible as their moral and religious guide that women cannot speak to God. And that ends that chapter. So let me know what you all think. Very, very interesting information. Again, I'm not reading this to cause strife. This is all about the truth. Everything that we do is to speak in the language of truth. We know that we've been given a lot of things, and the things that we have been given have been tampered with, just crazy. And our goal is to get back to our creator, to get back to the earth, to live naturally, and to be who we are without the influence of devils and demons. So with that, I say shalom. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Donate to Sister for Sisters at Cash App or PayPal. Shalom, family.